Well, welcome to the world of macro photography. We're going to start off with what is macro photography, and it's often referred to small subjects, magnified subjects, or close up. The true definition is where the size of the subject on the image sensor is life size or greater, often referred to as a 1-to-1 ratio. So for example, your full frame sensor, several view, 36 millimeters in width. Therefore, when you get to your closest focusing distance, you can actually capture 36 millimeters on a ruler. So that's your 1-to-1 ratio. If you have a smaller sensor for cropped sensor cameras, for instance, mine is 17 millimeters. If I capture 17 millimeters, then I have a 1-to-1 ratio. So here again is the definition. And if you look at the scenario here, so I'm capturing an image at the closest focusing distance. So I move my lens as close as it can focus and then just get it sharp and focus. And if I capture 17 millimeters, that gives me a 1-to-1 ratio. An example of doing that with closest minimum focus is pull the subject as close as you can to the camera when it's out of focus, and then as it starts coming into focus, move the subject away, and then you'll find your sharpest focus. So you can see in the video here, I'm moving it closer, then pushing it back a little bit further away till it gets the sharpest focus. That's my minimum focusing distance, the smallest distance for it to focus. And then I can fine tune using manual focus as well. So when it comes to macro photography, gear that is crucial for success is a tripod. Although I will have to say there are small occasions that I will shoot handheld, but my #1 preference is to use a tripod, and better success comes from tripods. Using a shutter release or a timer, as well as mirror up with many of these mirrored cameras that you all own. And lastly, you want some kind of lens that's going to give you some form of magnification, whether it's a macro lens, a long lens, so like a telephoto lens, or a close-up filter. We have several of these items in the checkout room as well. Also today I'm going to cover a little bit about extension tubes, diffusers, reflectors, polarizing filters, and even a WIMBERLEY PLAMP. So it'll prepare you for our field trip next week. So first off, tripods and shutter, pretty straightforward to stabilize any movement of the camera. Using a tripod, when you are so magnified with true macro photography, it's very easy to miss the sliver of focus just because you're so close to the subject, and depending on your f-stop and your focal length, all of those things play into effect. And so if you have your camera on a tripod, it minimizes any camera movement. Shutter release and timer, especially if you end up at a slower shutter speed, that helps as well. And then lastly, if you have a DSLR, you want to find the mirror up feature, because if you are shooting with a slower shutter speed, you can create movement just by the camera taking the image by flipping up the mirror. So if you have it in mirror up, it'll minimize movement of the camera. So find that feature. All right, so back to the macro lens. Again, to get that true 1-to-1 ratio, you are at the closest, the minimum focusing distance, the closest minimum focusing distance. So pull your subject or move the camera to your subject as close as possible for you to still obtain sharp focus, and that's your minimum focusing distance. You can practice that on any subject prior to our field trip, but it's a good idea to have an idea of how close that is. For those of you that have macro lenses, more common length, focal length lenses are 60, 100, 105, 180. We have several in the checkout room as well. Many of you might own a 50 millimeter that also does a true 1-to-1. That will work fine. If you don't have a macro lens, you can also capture close-up images for this assignment. So grab the longest lens you have. Maybe you have a 200, or you're going to check out the 300 from the equipment room, or the 50 to 500 from the equipment room. So you can also obtain a very similar effect using long lenses, and I will accept all of those options for the class. So kind of think through what focal length you have, what's your best option, or what you can check out from the equipment room. Another option is close-up filters. We do again have several of these in the checkout room, and the Raynox DCR 250, for those of you who took the macro class, are familiar with those, and I do have 4 of those. I'll be bringing those to class next week so people can give those a try if you'd like. But close-up filters are really inexpensive. You can buy them for 40, 50 bucks or more, as you can see on the slide here. The 2 images in the bottom of the screen here, the 2 flower images, were both shot with a $40 close-up filter, and they were published in a book. And so you can get high quality if you know what you're doing. And if you don't want to hassle with the macro lens itself, you can just screw these filters onto the end of your regular kit lens. So check out in the equipment room what we have available. Again, you may need to get a step-up ring, and but they're very inexpensive. And if you check it out soon, you can have it in time for class. Extension tubes is another option to increase magnification. And these are hollow tubes, so there's no glass in them. And they come in sets of 2 or 3. The Nikon and Canon sets have a set of 3, like you see in the image down below. And those 3 tubes can be used individually or stacked all together. And they increase the distance between the lens and the camera. So by increasing that distance, you add magnification. So it's we do have several of these sets in the equipment room to check out as well. So feel free to give that a try or test it prior. On the next slide, you'll see some example images. One downside to it is because it does lengthen the lens. If you have really windy days like we sometimes get in Flagstaff, you can end up getting more camera movement. So something to keep in mind. So here's an example. These 2 images, the one on the left was shot with a regular 60mm macro lens, and the one on the right was taken with the macro lens plus 52mm of extension. So both of them, I just set it up to focus at the minimum focusing distance, and it's a huge difference in the magnification that's possible in the image on the right. Okay, a couple of images just to kind of see how much closer you can get to the subject. So the image on the left is without extension tubes. Image on the right is with extension tubes. That's with my crop sensor camera. And here's a few examples when it comes to a full frame camera. So notice how much longer the camera and the lens becomes in that bottom right-hand photo. Because of the extension tubes, you've really extended the 105mm lens a long distance. And that's where, if it's a windy day, you could see that your lens might jiggle some because it's weighted unevenly, even though there's a tripod. All right, a couple examples of, this is the Micro Four Thirds system, and just using the extension tubes again on location and what the finished image looks like. One last shot here. And you can see the little circle with the orange dot, that is the mushroom. So using extension tubes and the macro lens. If you notice the end of the lens, there is also a filter there. That's a circular polarizing filter. So I could eliminate some of the glare and reflections. All right, so just to give you a little bit of an idea when it comes to what you can achieve with different lenses, and based on if you're going to do more of a close-up or more of a full macro one-to-one. Here is 3 different samples. So the top right-hand corner is the regular 12 to 100mm lens. It's shot at about 38mm. And then putting on the 68mm macro on the left. And these are all at the minimum focusing distance. And then the image on the right is adding the extension tubes. So the image on the left is considered a 1-to-1 ratio. All right, let's talk about shooting macro and how to get the best images possible based on your camera position, focus, and settings. So first off, you want to have the end of the lens on a parallel plane to the flowers or to the subject that you're photographing. So in that case, notice the flatness of the front of the lens. You want it to be just as flat to the front of the flower or the center insides of the flower. So if you look at the image on the right, that is on a much more parallel plane to the center, the inside of the flower, than the first image is. And here is the result of those two images. So the top left-hand corner, notice that whole center is not all sharp. Part of it is in focus, part of it is not. The bottom left-hand corner image, all of that is sharp, and that's because the angle changed. So whenever you are capturing images and you want all of it sharp, look to the side, look and see how your camera is lined up and whether it's parallel or not to the subject. There are also creative liberties when it comes to macro and all photography, is that you get to decide what is in focus and what isn't in focus. So make sure you are familiar with your focusing areas and modes, and so you can pinpoint the focus. So the first image, applying rule of thirds, the focused part is the bottom left-hand corner, where if you had two horizontal and two vertical lines, where they intersect in that bottom left-hand corner, we call that a PowerPoint. So that Poppy is on the PowerPoint. The center image, same thing. The image on the right, that's a little bit more of a centered image. And in my opinion, the background's a little bit distracting too, because it's not quite out of focus enough. So more could be done there, but because the flowers are all on a pretty level plane, almost all of those flowers in that right-hand image are sharp. So something to consider is, once you achieve focus, is then start looking at your composition, how you can make a stronger image. All right, when it comes to macro, you want to figure out what your depth of field needs to be. And in most cases, what we're going to be doing in this class are all single images, so we won't have a need to focus stack. And so you really want to kind of figure out what that best f-stop is going to be. You know, a wider open aperture, f2.8, is going to have less in focus than f16. But because of the longer focal length and the closeness to our subject, it's a pretty negligible difference between those two f-stops. So really pay attention to what your shutter speed becomes, because if the shutter speed gets too slow, you might get camera movement. And so a lot of times I'll shoot around f4, f5.6 if I'm not going to focus stack, because that fall off of focus ends up working really well. Ways that you can see this and achieve it: if you have live view in your camera, macro is one opportunity that I highly encourage using it, because you can really fine tune your focus much better, as well as you know, get a better view when it comes to composition. Many cameras do have options of tethering, so if you do end up shooting anything in a studio setting, you can look into the tethering options with your camera and software setup. But back to the regular aperture, here are some examples that just give you an idea of the difference in the f-stops. So the image on the two images on the left, that is layers of paint from Cadillac Ranch in Texas. And notice the difference between f2.8 and f16. And the depth of paint is not even 1/4 of an inch. So by going from f2.8 to f16, several stops difference in light, I do achieve more focus, but it's still not all in focus. As you look at the two flower images, the difference between 2.8 and 6.3 does help the flower to become more sharper and the stem, but it also causes the background to be sharper. So at some point you have to pick and choose what is the best f-stop based on how you want your background to look and how you want the single subject to look as well. I've mentioned before, because of camera shake, you want to consider that shutter speed. So make sure it's something fast enough. And if you were to do inanimate subjects such as splashes, you want to have a very fast shutter speed or be using flash in order to stop that action. The image on the right, the plant here, this was in Florida, and that was an example of close-up. So using a 300mm lens. But because I have such a long lens, my shutter speed should not be anything slower than 1/, the focal length. So that means it really should not have been anything slower than 1/300. However, I was on a tripod, so that's why I was able to push it to 1/250th. So remember that 1/, focal length rule if you're using a long lens. That means you want to keep that shutter speed to 1/, whatever the focal length is. All right, so kind of putting it all together, when I'm shooting, these particular images were shot in the studio, but it gives you an idea. Once you find your subject, you set everything up, start figuring it out for close focus, set that focus and your exposure, check your histogram, capture your photo. Then you go back and review. So the first image had a lot more in focus, and I thought, well, it might be a little better to change the f-stop and make it more selective focus. So I opened up my aperture, and now I have a lot less in focus. And then I realized, but it's not in a great spot in the frame. So if I recompose, I can get a little bit better image. So it's okay to take multiple images in order to get your way to what you want to accomplish. If you just take one and done, you're probably not going to get the best options and the best photos. Here's another example. So again, I did all the steps 1 through 3, captured the photo. What I really liked were these little tubes up here, but they are almost totally centered when it comes to focus or composition. So I reshot, placing them down lower in the frame. Notice when I did that, I also discovered I have a little piece of hair or lint or something that was on that flower. So then I could do some touch up in post-processing. So something to keep in mind, every picture you submit, you should be doing post-processing. That's why you don't have to submit 20 photos at a time. You just submit a few. Do your touch up. Really take pride in your work. All right. So that's a lot of the basic techniques when it comes to macro. Now let's talk just a little bit about light and how we can make even stronger images just by the impact of light. So a couple examples here, both using a diffuser and without. Both images work great. It just depends on what your personal perspective is and what your creative aspects are and what you're looking for. So light is described through quantity and intensity, quality, color, and direction. So even simple macro subjects, just by changing the light, the angle, the power, the color, all of it will make a huge difference in images. So the top two, that was after a storm, and just by adding a diffuser, completely changes the look on the image. The bottom two images, that the grasshoppers, that was from morning to afternoon. So the difference is cloud cover came in the afternoon. Notice how that also changes the color balance. So if you don't have a diffuser, we have them in the equipment room. And that's what's so cool about macro photography is we can just add a diffuser to anything we want because it's a small scene that we're looking at, those details. And again, when I say macro, that also includes close-up photography. So a reflector adds light to the scene, but diffusers are used all the time. You can even make your own shower curtain, sheet, copy paper. The image on the right was diffused with a Safeway grocery store bag because I forgot my diffuser and I had a Safeway bag in my car. Otherwise, to use a diffuser, it's just as simple as that. You just hold it between the sun and the subject and you get a wide variety of images. Another setup, just my garden at home. It will change your shutter speed. That's why the importance of a tripod and keeping things consistent and still are advantageous. If you end up shooting a lot of water or foliage, so leaves and flowers, this makes a big difference too. That's the circular polarizing filter. You already know what filters we have for your lenses, or hopefully you've gone out and purchased a step-up ring, again for 10 bucks or less, so you can use all the great gear we have. And if you want to photograph those items with foliage or with water, it's a quick little spin of a circular polarizer, and you can see the remarkable changes in the results. Okay, last thing, if you were to really get into macro photography, this is something I recommend to other people in particular. I will bring mine for the field trip so anyone can play with it if they'd like. But a WIMBERLEY PLAMP clamps to your tripod and then clamps to the flower. So especially when it's windy up here in Flagstaff, it can really save the image from any kind of movement. And if you see, like for instance, this piece of grass back here, if that becomes a distraction, Don't pick it and prune it and destroy nature, but groom the area. So maybe you can tuck it behind something else or just tuck it under and then have it come back up. So in the example on the right-hand side over here, this piece of blade of grass, that's one that I could just kind of tip over and connect to another piece of foliage, and then it was just out of the way for the image. Okay, here you can see when you have movement. So if the wind's blowing like that, that's where a WIMBERLEY PLAMP is going to come in handy, because otherwise you're going to struggle getting a still enough shot. All right, next, always consider those backgrounds. Now I know if you have a bumblebee, they may not always behave as you want, but if you study their behavior, just like regular wildlife, you can kind of start getting trends and anticipating their movement. So this was another picture from our garden. Notice just by being patient for the image on the right, I was able to work myself around to a different angle of the flower and then get a picture where I didn't have the bright purple in the background. So always consider those backgrounds to make the simplest image possible. A couple more with grasshoppers now, and these grasshoppers were again in my backyard, and you can see the brick wall from the house. And with the two images on the left, the brighter areas in the background, those are either the sprinkler box or part of the window or the piping from the sprinklers. Different things like that is what's kind of causing this different coloration in the background. And although I couldn't train the grasshopper, because if I got too close, he would move around more. So I was just really patient, and the more he got used to the camera on the tripod sitting there, he would be a little bit more patient. So then I could use my hand to reach on the left side, and then he'd come over a little bit closer towards me so that I could really adjust what was in the background of my frame. So here are the two final images. So the image on the right was shot with a similar setup to what you see on the far right with the camera. But the image on the left, I then shot from the other side. So I was paying attention to the light. Of the two grasshopper images, the one on the right is considered more front light, but the one on the left is backlight. So that angle in light makes a huge difference in how it complements the subject. And look at the difference in colors of the subject too, just by how the light is illuminating. So really walk around your subject and find that best light. Okay, backgrounds. If you don't have a great background that's just natural, you can throw in artificial backgrounds. So this is a Richardson's geranium from up in Colorado, and the image on the bottom right, that was natural. The other two images are pieces of boards that I sometimes carry. So the image on the left, actually it could be a foam board, but this one really ended up being my diffuser. I put it in the background and it's bright enough white that it illuminated as the background and gave me a really nice white. The other one with the green, that is a green board or green piece of paper. You'll see that in a future image as well. So with macro subjects, it doesn't take a very big piece, like 8 by 10 is all you would need to carry around if you want to use that. Blackboards are common too. Or sometimes you can take an image that you have that maybe isn't a very good image, blur it intentionally and print it, and then that becomes kind of a random background, especially if it was like greens and browns or something like that. It makes a really good background. Okay, a couple other helpful tips. If you really want to get creative, you can get a little squirt bottle and spray. If I remember, I'll bring my little squirt bottle. People can give that a try. The finer the mist, the better possibilities. Both of the images on this screen though that have water drops, those were actual raindrops. That was not added to the subject. But the purple image, top center, that's by having something close in the foreground. So having other blue grape hyacinths that I'm shooting through just to add a little softness to the frame. And then the bottom image shows a diffusion box, which this one I just made by using some frosty plexiglass, Velcroed the pieces together, and then there's that piece of green construction paper as a background. So you can kind of see that setup a little better. I'm not going to go through this live shoot, but there is another one that you'll get a chance to click on and on here. So again, you've got diffused and not diffused. Again, both images are acceptable, but which one tells a better story? Which one creates more drama or more of a wow factor? So similar to before, putting it all together, I do all the setup, I set my focus and exposure, and then I change focus so that I'm getting a better focus on the center of the flowers. The examples here, similarly, the first one, I have a distraction in the background. The second one, I've cleaned up the background, but there's not enough contrast in the frame. So the third image, I actually decreased the exposure a little bit just to get more of a background, and then did some touch up in Lightroom by working that exposure more to add more contrast. A couple more on location examples. The original image on the left, I added diffusion and I still didn't like it. I changed the composition. Then the fourth image on the right, I changed the aperture and a new composition. So I keep working the subject, keep working the subject. And then this ended up my final image. So again, I really wide open aperture because I wanted a much less busy background. I'm still using a diffuser, but because it was harsh sunlight, it softens the light, but there are still noticeable shadows. And then the last thing, I'm going to have you guys take a look at a link, the next link on shooting on location. It's just a couple minutes long, and you'll see this sulfur buckwheat shoot. Okay, so you want to bring your macro gear and everything you might need for that to class, and we're going to be walking around campus shooting macro subjects.